Of course, the CIA has to be a leading suspect in terms of motive and opportunity when it comes to the assassination of JFK. And yet, as I said, when they created the Warren Commission, Alan Dulles, probably a chief suspect, ended up on the Warren Commission to lead the investigation.
JFK Files are the talk of the Beltway and the talk of the media and the talk of social media right now. So Glenn Greenwald recently had a podcast where he went into what was divulged by these new releases of the JFK Files, and especially what it means for the CIA's involvement in that story. And also he gets a little bit into what this teaches us about what the CIA and the deep state tends to redact in secret government classified documents. So let's give it a listen and let's react.
One of Trump's longtime promises and one of the demands for a long time of the American people is to release all of the JFK files, not just the files the government has thus far deigned to release, but all of them in unredacted form. And the argument in favor of that is quite obvious. Namely, the JFK assassination happened in 1963, which is more than 60 years ago. And there's no conceivable argument, no plausible argument that releasing the documents could endanger national security or put anyone in danger. Essentially everybody, every adult in connection with those files, the important players, are deceased a long time ago. There may be a few people who are alive and in their 80s or 90s, but there's really, they would have been 18 or 20 or 22, not playing key roles at all. And there was actually legislation that required all the documents to be released in 2017. And Trump did release many of those documents in 2017, but withheld many because many in his party, many in the national security state, insisted, screamed bloody murder, that if he were to release all of them in an unredacted form, they would jeopardize national security, put operations at risk, etc. All the arguments that they always invoke to keep things secret.
And what's interesting about this, too, is one of the things that came out about why a lot of these documents were withheld from the initial release that Trump did in his first term is that RFK Jr. said straight up that the reason for withholding the newer docs that just came out at that time was Mike Pompeo, former CIA director and total deep state stooge, regime change enthusiast, pleaded with him not to, and that's why he didn't.
And during the campaign in 2024, Trump repeatedly vowed he's done with that. He's going to release not just the JFK files, but all the files pertaining to the Martin Luther King assassination, as well as the RFK assassination, as well as the Epstein files.
That didn't turn out so hot.
The Epstein files release to this point, has been a debacle. They invited a bunch of conservative influencers to the White House, handed them big binders, and on the outside it said, Epstein files release, part 1, and they waved it around. And a lot of people were like, wow, what's in here? And as it turned out, essentially every document that they released had already been released, was already publicly available. There was essentially nothing in there worthwhile in any way.
Yeah, that was
whatever interesting documents that there are clearly are the ones still being withheld. Trump's promising they're going to be released in a timely fashion, as I talked about last night with Ian Carroll. For me, the primary question in the Epstein case, obviously aside from who in power was using or having sex with the minor girls that he trafficked, is whether, as is extremely likely, he was working with a foreign intelligence agency as an intelligence operation or a blackmail operation to put powerful people in compromising positions so that they would have to serve the agenda toward which he was working.
Notably Israel, because we know that Epstein was extremely close with Ehud Barak, former prime minister of Israel, who consistently visited with him in, I believe, throughout the 90s.
And by far the most likely intelligence agency that he had connections with, for a whole variety of reasons, including the people who were around him who made him rich, was the Mossad, or Israel's intelligence agencies. And I just do not believe at all that if there are documents corroborating that, that we will ever see them, certainly not in the next 4 years, given how many fanatical Israel supporters populate essentially the entire Trump administration.
I have to agree with that. There's never going to be a classified document that really says, yeah, the CIA is involved in a child sex trafficking scandal. It's just not going to happen that way. So, we might get bits and pieces and morsels here about information, but they're never going to even put that in classified documentation. The paper trail would just ruin them all.
But we'll see when those documents are released, if they're really all released. But Trump undeniably deserves real credit for releasing all of the JFK documents, all of them, including unredacting many of the passages of key documents that were released in 2017, but with huge redactions. They no longer have those redactions. There are documents historians and others interested in the question of JFK's assassination have long wanted to see. And now we can compare them side by side and see what was redacted and now was unredacted and see what they wanted to hide and why. And the answer seems very obvious, because there's a lot of illuminating information about that secret part of our government, about other governments, that the CIA is always desperate to hide. But before we get to that, I just want to show you what Trump had to do in order to get these documents released. This is from the New York Times yesterday. Inside the 24-hour scramble among top national security officials over the JFK documents, quote, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency emphasized that some documents had nothing to do with the assassinated president, according to people familiar with the discussions. Quote, President Trump's national security team was stunned and forced to scramble after he announced on Monday that he would release 80,000 pages of documents related to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy with only 24 hours notice. Administration officials have been working on releasing the record since January, when Mr. Trump signed an executive order mandating it. But that process was still underway on Monday afternoon when Mr. Trump, during a visit to the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, said the files would be made available the next day. By Tuesday evening, when about 64,000 files were made public, fewer than Mr. Trump had estimated, some of the country's top national security officials have spent hours trying to assess any possible hazards under extreme deadline pressures. John Ratcliffe, the director of the CIA, had been emphasizing to senior administration officials that some documents had nothing to do with Mr. Kennedy and were developed decades after the assassination, according to 4 people with knowledge of the discussions. He wanted to make sure that other officials were fully aware of what the files contained and would not be caught off guard, but he was clear that he would not seek to impede any files from being released, the people said, speaking on the condition of anonymity to discuss sensitive internal deliberations.
John Ratcliffe is by far, if you ask me, one of Trump's worst appointments. He's now the director of the CIA. He was responsible for being one of the chief architects of the FISA 702 extension in Congress. And what that is, it's a deep state scheme to be able to warrantlessly wiretap Americans, and if they come into contact with someone who they arbitrarily deem to be an enemy or a terrorist. This is a way to violate the Fourth Amendment, and Ratcliffe is a total enemy of, civil liberties, constitutional guarantees, and transparency in general. So this is no surprise that he would have opposed this release.
Officials involved in the process of declassification said the number of files had expanded greatly over many decades. With each investigation into Kennedy-related material, information that had nothing to do with the assassinated president had come under that umbrella. In some cases, that includes documents created decades after his death, according to one person with knowledge of the process. For decades, historians and conspiracy theorists alike have clamored for more information on Kennedy's death. A conspiracy theorist, by the way, is someone who is open to the possibility or believes the evidence already suggests that there are other actors in the assassination besides this loner Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone. That's what the New York Times calls a conspiracy theorist. A 1992 law required the government to release documents related to the killing within 25 years, except documents that could harm national security. In 2017, which was the date when they were supposed to be released, Mr. Trump did release some additional documents, but he also gave the intelligence agencies more time to assess the files and include redactions. Tucker Carlson, the former Fox News personality, not journalist, personality, and associated Mr. Trump, said the president came to regret that decision. And Mr. Trump has cast his effort to release the documents as the fulfillment of a long-held promise to the American people. That's what it is. It's a long-held promise to the American people made over many decades. I didn't live through the JFK assassination. I know everyone who I knew who did, including my parents, found it extremely traumatic. There was that famous phrase that everybody remembers exactly where they were decades later when they heard the news that President Kennedy had been assassinated. Obviously an extraordinary event in American political life.
Yeah, if you ask your folks, I mean, for my generation, we say that about 9/11. Everyone knows where we were when that happened. For that generation, this is just kind of the epitome of, American political story, of the century.
And there were a lot of questions because this was a Democratic president, a young Democratic president who came into office after 8 years of Cold War governance by Dwight Eisenhower, the Republican five-star general. And there were things he wanted to change. And there were reforms he proposed. And like I said, he actually fired probably the most powerful person in Washington, Allen Dulles, who was running the CIA for all those years since its inception, at the same time that his brother, John Foster Dulles, was the Secretary of State. So they had control both of the State Department and the foreign policy run out of that, as well as the CIA.
Yeah, if you want to talk underappreciated, people for their power, not in terms, I'm not a Dulles fan, but in terms of his name recognition versus the power he wielded, there's a huge disparity. Allen Dulles wielded extreme power as kind of the chief architect of the foundation of the CIA, building it into the intelligence service, the regime change architects that we know of today out of the OSS, and I think 47 or 48. Allen Dulles is, one of the true villains of the 20th century, if you ask me.
And Kennedy fired Allen Dulles after the Bay of Pigs debacle, which Kennedy, over the objections of a lot of his aides, was persuaded to sign on to and authorize in order to invade Cuba and get rid of Fidel Castro. A lot of right-wing Cubans in the United States were fanatical supporters of that idea. There's certainly a lot of evidence that they had connections to the assassination along with the CIA, along with the mafia. That has always been well documented for a long time. But of course, people wanted to know, rightly so, whether the real story of the JFK assassination had ever been disclosed. The Warren Commission, which was created in order to investigate and supposedly tell everybody what happened, was always suspect from the start for a lot of different reasons. As I said, Allen Dulles, arguably leading suspect, someone who had run the CIA forever, was put on the Warren Commission along with a bunch of establishment goons, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Senator Arlen Specter, and they, of course, concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, unsurprisingly. They had to explain several bullet trajectories and bullet directions that seemed highly implausible to have come from one gunman. They invented what is now mockingly called the magic bullet theory. There's always been questions surrounding that, and the answers have been in the government archives for 60 years.
Just think of that. The CIA director who Kennedy fired over the Bay of Pigs and the debacle that was, and it truly was, is a false flag operation. It truly was. To put him on the Warren Commission that's going to investigate the assassination of Kennedy, what a conflict of interest that is. And he was obviously the most well-known and influential person of that commission. It just stank, and people that follow this at the time pointed this out.
More than 60 years. And credit to President Trump for releasing them. As I said, I wouldn't say that there's a smoking gun in here that says, oh, actually, the mafia killed him, or Cuban nationalists in Miami killed him, or the CIA killed him, or foreign intelligence killed him. But there's certainly a lot of clues, a lot of important information, which is why these documents have been withheld for so long. One of the most interesting documents was a memo that was written in 1961, shortly after the Bay of Pigs, just humiliation, that was run by the CIA. That's what led Kennedy to fire Allen Dulles and to be enraged by the CIA. And he asked one of his most important advisors, Arthur Schlesinger, who was a historian, professor at Harvard, who left Harvard to go to work for the Kennedy administration to sort of be this floating advisor, somebody who the Kennedys held in extremely high regard. He wrote a memo in 1961 to JFK about all the ways in which the CIA had become completely out of control, completely anti-democratic, utterly subversive to the American Constitution, and he proposed radical changes for how to rein in the CIA. Basically take away all the autonomy that they had given to themselves from the time it was created, basically in 1947, under the National Security Act, until 1961. And one of his main proposals was to transfer a lot of the functions of the CIA to the State Department, so that you didn't have two competing agencies in the State Department, in the federal government, the State Department and the CIA, both running their separate foreign policies.
Yeah, lie profusely and kill 1 million people and they'll make you president. But if you propose to end a war or abolish the CIA, you will be crucified in Washington. That's what Schlesinger found out. And that's what anyone that's an enemy of the deep state that comes close to the reins of power finds out ultimately.
And that was one of the things that was on the agenda. Obviously, people understood that Kennedy was looking carefully at the CIA. Here you can see part of how the redactions work. There's the 1961 memo. I can't see that on my screen, so I'm not sure why. Maybe we can turn that screen on so I can see it. But you see it on the left, and you see an entire page, which is here, that had been redacted along with this entire section here. But now, as a result of President Trump's order, we can read the entire portion and see what it is that they wanted to hide. And we'll get to that in a second. There's a lot of other documents like that had been previously released in partial form. And now that we have the full unredacted document, we can see exactly what was hidden. This is true for a document that's called the McCord document as well. Here on the left, you can see the description of the CIA program from 1965 to 1966 that purports to describe what they were doing. James McCord, by the way, ended up being a leading figure in the Watergate break-in as well. So lots of connections to the CIA with everything that brought down Richard Nixon. And they were talking about CIA capability, a new CIA capability that they had developed. But even when it was released in 2017, it was still redacted. And now you can see the filled-in redactions. It talks about how the CIA had developed a unique technique in fluoroscopic scanning, which is considered to be a major breakthrough in the detection of clandestine microphones and other devices targeted against the agency. It gives them, for the first time, the capability to detect hidden technical listening devices. There's x-rays that are used with it. I mean, this is 65-year-old technology. Why did that have to be concealed until now? Everyone understands that the CIA, everyone has this technology and far, far more advanced technology. So a lot of times, and this is one of the things I learned with the Snowden files, obviously the US government abuses their secrecy powers to conceal things from the public that are highly incriminating of the US government. Things that they don't want the public to know, not because it would endanger the public, but because it would endanger the reputations or even the legal status of the people who are hiding these documents. That's true for a lot of documents. Obviously, that was true for a lot of Snowden documents as well, which is why the Snowden story had such implications, such consequences.
So they're above the law. If you're a deep state bureaucrat with this level of power, you're not susceptible to the same pushback that any private citizen would get for doing the same thing in the private world. It's just utterly crazy, and we're supposed to believe that these people are our servants. These bureaucrats are doing the job that we want them to do. They're working on behalf of our representatives. Stuff like that is just totally mythical, and this is one of the episodes that really shows it.
But one of the things I learned, I mean, we read through hundreds of thousands, if not more, top secret documents that have been labeled top secret. The vast majority of them were worthless, empty of meaning, totally banal. and yet they were still marked top secret. Time out. How to get parking credentials or how to ask your supervisor for a vacation. Just thousands of just very banal bureaucratic documents day to day that has nothing really to do with the NSA's function or capability, and yet they were all marked top secret. And the lesson I took from that is that the US government is at a point where it reflexively believes everything it does should be hidden from the public.
Yeah, that's the default in Washington rather than the exception. And it's been a long road toward that point, but it's been in the last century where it's really taken root, especially since the end of World War II, where they've turned the deep state bureaucracies against the American public, against transparency, against the Constitution, and against privacy and transparency.
If you think about, and I've made this point before, an ideal free society, in that kind of a society, we should basically know everything that the government is doing, with a few exceptions. If they're in a war and they're planning troop movements, like the invasion on D-Day, things like that, obviously they don't want to disclose that in advance. There's some legitimate secrecy, but by and large, we're supposed to know everything the government is doing, because if we don't, there's no meaning to democracy. We can't decide to vote for or against our government if we don't even know the most consequential things that they're doing. They're doing them in the dark behind a wall of secrecy.
That's the best argument for this. You cannot be truly informed to make decisions in terms of voting or political activism if you're not armed with the information it takes to make accurate or knowledgeable decisions in that regard. So Glenn is so right on this. It's such an understated point that I think goes overlooked. And, it really needs to be repeated.
And we are at the point where we essentially know nothing that they do except when they want to tell us what they're doing, because they've erected this wall of secrecy where essentially entire parts of the government, obviously the CIA and the US security state and the military industrial complex, just use secrecy for everything. They've become totally opaque. And then conversely, the US government is not supposed to know much at all about us. They're not supposed to keep dossiers on us. They're not supposed to spy on us. Again, there's rare exceptions if they go to a court and convince a court that there's probable cause to believe that we've involved in a crime or terrorist organization, and therefore surveillance is merited. But in general, they're not supposed to keep files or dossiers or other data on what we do. That's why we're called private citizens and they're called public officials. What they do is supposed to be public, what we do is supposed to be private, and that's been completely reversed. They keep all kinds of data about us. They spy on us constantly. There's very little that you do online that they don't know about. I don't mean they're watching every second. I mean they have the capability to do so.
Yeah, it's the ultimate inversion. The Snowden revelations and the NSA bulk data collection really brought this to light in a new way, and Glenn was intimately involved in blowing the cover off that. And we've seen it so much in terms of the CIA and the FBI and just the entire deep state complicity with that, and what it means to be transparent as private citizens, but secretive as government officials, and just the ultimate perversion of our privacy.
And there's huge parts of what they do, most, in fact, consequential acts that are just kept completely in the dark from. And seeing these redactions, in some senses, reveals certain things that they wanted to hide that's meaningful, but in a lot of cases, it just shows that they're reflexively hiding everything, even for 65 years. To the point where even now the CIA director is objecting and saying, we're not ready for you to release this. You can't unredact everything. That's just their instinct. It's their impulse. And it's a highly authoritarian one and a highly anti-democratic one. Let's look at some of this Schlesinger memo, because there's so many interesting passages, some of which had previously been released.
Oh, I've seen this one. This one's my favorite.
Many of which had not been. About the CIA. Remember the time period here. As I mentioned before, Dwight Eisenhower was leaving office after 8 years. And on his way out, he had about 10 minutes on primetime television on the networks, the three networks, to give his farewell speech and to warn Americans about what he thought they ought to be most aware of. And one of the things he warned about, in fact, one of the primary things in his speech was what he called the emergence of a military-industrial complex, a fusion of the armed services being so dominant and merging with corporate power in a way that, as he described it, that faction of the government is becoming quickly, if they're not already, more powerful than even the highest elected official, which is the president, which was Eisenhower. And the fact that it came from a war hero of World War II, a five-star general, somebody who had devoted his entire life to the military, made that warning all the more acute, all the more meaningful. This was not somebody with hostility to the military-industrial complex. Quite the contrary, but he felt like it had been threatening the democratic order. And now this memo, warning of the dangers of the CIA and how they're this completely unconstrained and independent agency that basically does whatever it wants with no democratic supervision, was in 1961 after the Bay of Pigs failure. So think about all the different ways in which that part of our government, the U.S. military-industrial complex and the CIA and the U.S. intelligence community, have massively grown since this Eisenhower warning, since this Schlesinger memo. This was before the war in Vietnam. We went to war for 12, 13 years in a foreign country and just had massive buildups of the Pentagon, of the military, of corporate power, of arms dealers, of the intelligence community, spying on all the social movements of the 1960s. Then we had the dirty wars under President Reagan in the 1980s, where the CIA was engineering all kinds of coups, engaged in all kinds of terrorist activities in Central America, in places like Nicaragua and El Salvador and Guatemala. And obviously they need a lot more power and a lot more budgetary authority to do so. There was the famous Iran-Contra scandal where the Congress, knowing that the Reagan administration wanted to overthrow the government of Nicaragua, enacted a law saying you cannot use any funds to finance the rebels in Nicaragua who were the Contras, who were largely murderous gangs. I mean, they killed enormous numbers of people. And then the Reagan White House, and Reagan said he didn't know anything about it, but high-level officials, that was like John Poindexter and Oliver North, and also George Bush 41, who had run the CIA previously but now was vice president, sold highly sophisticated weapons secretly to Iran, just flooded Iran with all kinds of highly powerful missiles and tanks, and then took the money and secretly financed the Contras in Nicaragua, even though the Congress had defunded that and prohibited any money from going there. That just gives you a sense of how much power this part of the government has, how they run their own policy in secret, not just without Congress knowing, but in contravention of what they've done, what the policies they passed, the laws they passed.
And almost no one seems to push back on it. Our elected officials can't even gain or glean information from them. They're more powerful and elevated in stature and clothed in just this incredible ambition to be able to maintain that for so long.
And then probably most important of all, this of course was before the war on terror and the 20-year war that is really only ending now. That was largely run through special forces, through the CIA, through the NSA. And this part of our government grew even more and more and more. So it's been 60 years of unrestrained growth where they've gotten more and more powerful. And even before that happened, you had high-level people in both parties who knew everything about the government warning that this was a major threat, this deep state was, to the democratic order. And I still am amazed. In 2017, early 2017, when I saw that the CIA and the FBI were behind the Russiagate hoax, and they were essentially looking to sabotage the Trump presidency before it even began, I wrote an article at The Intercept with the headline, "Deep State Goes to War with the Elected President." And this is the first time that article was a lot of people in conservative media had heard the term deep state. Rush Limbaugh started using it, Sean Hannity started using it. And as a result, a lot of liberals reacted to this term, the deep state, as though it was some bizarre right-wing fringe conspiracy theory. When in fact, the deep state in the United States has been central to understanding the US government for decades. Academics have used it. In fact, it was a term widely popular on the left that was highly critical of this part of the government for a long time.
My favorite meme about this is the New York Times had a few editorials, and one of them, written by the same person, mockingly called, people that were starting to talk about the deep state just like lunatic conspiracy whacks. And then that person, I think it was like a year later or something, wrote another article that said, it turns out the deep state is real and it's awesome. You can look this up. I promise this exists. But it just shows how absurd, mocking people for pointing this out at the time were.
But then when they saw that that part of the government was at war with Trump, they started aligning themselves with them, defending them, and mocking the idea that the United States has a deep state.
Right.
Every liberal, every person in the Democratic Party I know mocked that idea, starting with in the Trump age. And yet you have just recent history. You just have to be knowledgeable and aware of just the most basic part of our history. We're not fringe conspiracy theorists, but the Republican president of the United States, a 5-star general, issued his warning about this, as did the top advisor, or a top advisor, of JFK. This is what they were most worried about, was the deep state. And here's the memo that Schlesinger wrote. Here you see the original memo. I read through it last night and this morning, and those are my highlights there. But we're going to put it up on the screen in a way that you can read it as well. It says, number 2, covert political operations technically require State Department clearance, but in practice, however, CIA has often been able to seize the initiative in ways which reduce State Department's role almost to that of a rubber stamp. This has been partly the consequence of the superior drive and activism of CIA personnel, especially compared with the diffidence of State Department personnel. For example, when men come to CIA with the assignment of developing covert political campaigns or organizing coups for preparing for paramilitary warfare, these men naturally call to work with ingenuity and zeal. They probably feel that they are not earning their pay, say, unless they organize as many coups as possible.
Just think about that. The highlighted sections are what was redacted for so many years. And this just confirms again what dissidents on the left and the right have been saying for decades about the CIA and their actual function. Like, not the function they purport to keep America safe, which is total hogwash, but to organize these regime change coups overseas. That is what the CIA and the deep state chose to redact in these memos. And it's just been coup after coup after coup, regime change after regime change. Egypt, Guatemala, Iran, Iraq, Ethiopia, Cuba, Laos, Chile. So many countries the U.S. has been involved in these operations, and they never work out to the U.S. benefit. That's what they want to hide from us.
There you see it on the screen. The part is highlighted that people go to the CIA and their role is to develop covert political campaigns inside other countries or organize coups or preparing for military warfare. In other words, just changing the governments of other countries at will. And this is why also when this whole Russiagate thing emerged, and all these people in the media, in the Democratic Party were so aghast, a lot of never-Trump conservatives were as well, that Russia would dare interfere in our internal affairs, in our sacred democracy, and depicted it, kind of portrayed it as it was though some unprecedented departure, this radical departure from the way that international relations had always been conducted. I, at the beginning, couldn't stop laughing until it got to the point where it actually made me sick. To be able to say that Russia had interfered in this grave, unprecedented way with a few Facebook pages and Twitter bots, when our government, not just in 1961, but through the next 60 years, including up to today, through the CIA and other agencies, engages in covert political operations. We discovered with U.S. aid that essentially every independent media outlet in Ukraine is funded by U.S. aid and the National Endowment for Democracy. We've changed governments all around the world. We continue to do it at will. The coup in Pakistan that removed the popular leader Imran Khan, who's now in prison, was given the green light, and supported and encouraged, in fact, by the US government under Joe Biden, by the CIA. This is what we do all the time. And to act like some Facebook pages and some Twitter bots was a grave threat to our democracy, or let alone the reason why, in the scheme of all the things that happened in the presidential election, Donald Trump won, was so inane, so ignorant, so intellectually stunted, so ahistorical.
Yeah, just imagine that, how brazen it is, and the type of acting skill that these corporate media and deep state hacks have to stare into the faces of the American people and tell them that Russian interference in the US elections was kind of unprecedented after these years of regime change operations. The acting involved in that, Daniel Day-Lewis and Al Pacino don't have. Like, that's an incredible, shameless thing to do, and a lot of these people know better. The people on the inside know that this is what's happened.
And just this memo alone demonstrates that. Schlesinger goes on, quote, "The result of the CIA's initiative in covert political operations has been to create situations which have forced policies on the State Department. This was not the original idea behind CIA. As Alan Dulles wrote in his 1947 memorandum to the Senate Armed Services Committee, which is when the CIA was being created, quote, the Central Intelligence Agency should have nothing to do with policy. Yet, in the years since, CIA has in fact, quote, made policy in many parts of the world. A number of governments still in power know that they have even been targets of CIA attempts at overthrow. Not a state of mind calculated to stimulate friendly feelings toward the United States. Indonesia, of course, is a prime example." Now, there's another part of this document, I don't think we have it, where Schlesinger describes the CIA as a state within a state. He says the CIA has basically begun making their own policy, has begun acting completely independent of foreign policy as carried out by the State Department and the White House. They have their own set of rules. They operate in secret, even from the democratically elected leaders, that they have become a state within a state, which is another way of describing a deep state. Arthur Schlesinger is a beloved figure in American liberalism because of the role he played in Camelot, in the royal court of JFK. He was an academic from Harvard. He was not a leftist at all, much more a centrist, supporter of the Cold War. But he was warning that the CIA had become what he called a, quote, a state within a state. And I had to listen for the last 10 years as liberals mocked the idea that we have such a thing, as though Sean Hannity invented it as a way of defending Donald Trump. Here's the conclusion of the memo. It says, quote, "The argument of this memorandum implies a fairly drastic rearrangement of our present intelligence setup. It also implies the capacity of the State Department to assume command of the situation and to do so in an effective and purposeful way. If the State Department at present staffed is not capable of assuming effective command of the CIA, this is not, in my judgment, an argument against a rational reorganization of intelligence. It is an argument for a drastic overhaul of the State Department." Now, this is not, let's call it a smoking gun, that the CIA was responsible for the JFK assassination. But certainly, this created enormous enmity, enormous antagonism between the CIA and the Kennedy White House. Not just this memo, but what was perceived to be Kennedy's dangerous attempt to impede the work of the CIA. And firing Alan Dulles, I think it's hard to convey from a historical perspective how significant that was. Alan Dulles was the most beloved figure of the Cold War. He worked overseas in secret intelligence operations during World War II. And throughout the 1950s, he basically ran the government with his brother, who was at the State Department. And he was a hardcore Cold Warrior. He was somebody who was perceived as sort of rolling up his sleeves and doing the dirty work that needed to be done for the United States. And JFK blamed him for the Bay of Pigs invasion and fired him. And for a long time, JFK opposed the Bay of Pigs invasion. Schlesinger, in fact, was vehemently opposed to it, as were other top aides of JFK, White House aides, people in the cabinet. And it was the CIA and the national security state that convinced him to do it, and it was a complete and total disaster. So the CIA perceived Kennedy as a dangerous impediment to their work, as a threat to what they were doing.
And the chief architect of the CIA, that was Dulles. Kind of there from the beginning, spearheaded its advent, and clearly carried resentment toward JFK for that. Also on the Warren Commission, of course.
And that culminated in the firing of Allen Dulles, which there's a reason why J. Edgar Hoover was never fired. He was the director of the FBI for 6 decades because people were petrified of him. He ran the CIA for 6 decades. He had dossiers.
FBI, he means here.
On everybody in Washington. And yet, the firing of Allen Dulles was, you could say, comparable in terms of the earthquake that it created inside of Washington power circles. And then you had a perceived resistance on the part of Kennedy to escalate the war in Vietnam. They knew about these memos, these attempts to reform CIA. And given that, as Schlesinger described quite presciently, the CIA had paramilitary operations, they threatened leaders, they killed leaders, they overthrew leaders. Everybody who knows history knows that. Of course, the CIA has to be a leading suspect in terms of motive and opportunity when it comes to the assassination of JFK. And yet, as I said, when they created the Warren Commission, Allen Dulles, probably a chief suspect, ended up on the Warren Commission to lead the investigation. And obviously people on that commission deferred to him because this was his area of expertise, his specialty. And he played a major, major role in the conclusion of the Warren Commission that, it was just Lee Harvey Oswald who acted alone. And remember, Lee Harvey Oswald was immediately shot and killed by Jack Ruby, just in custody in the police and the U.S. government. And he's walking down a hallway, and Jack Ruby just walks right up to him and shoots him twice in the abdomen, and then he dies. And there's no more Lee Harvey Oswald to hear from, to talk to.
Glenn acts as if lone nut shooters don't just get killed by lone nut shooters every day. That's typical occurrence, of course. At least if you're, swirled around this thing. I don't know how people bought into that was just, happenstance ever.
I mean, coincidences do happen. Very strange things happen in the world that are inexplicable. But believing that the JFK assassination was the work of just some lone person not operating in conjunction with any major power faction, even though he had all kinds of ties to a variety of different places. There's also a story of a CIA agent. He actually wasn't a CIA agent. He was an associate of the CIA, an informant for the CIA. This has been long known. Who, in the mid-1960s, was describing that how he had proof, he knew for sure that the CIA was involved in the assassination of JFK. And you had that New Orleans DA, Jim Garrison, who was the primary character in the film that Oliver Stone made about JFK, where he kind of gave an alternative history of what happened in that assassination. And that's ultimately what pretty much got one of the most powerful directors, one of the most celebrated directors, Oliver Stone, who had won 3 Academy Awards, essentially canceled, kicked out of Hollywood. The entire media turned against him because of that film, the JFK film. But Jim Garrison, the DA, was a real person, and he wanted to interview this CIA associate about his claims that the CIA was involved. And before he could, he made an appointment before he could. The name is slipping.
I can add clarity here because if Glenn can't remember, the guy's name is Gary Underhill. I think his legal birth name was John Garrett Underhill, and he's referred to as both in various documents. he claimed that a faction within the CIA was responsible for the Kennedy assassination. And within 6 months of making that statement, he was found in odd circumstances in his house with a bullet in his head. They claimed on the death certificate, I believe, that he committed suicide, but that's been debated for years and years and years. That didn't just come out yesterday. That's been known a long time. And this was no schlub. This guy was deeply involved in the U.S. intelligence services. He wasn't just this run-of-the-mill conspiracy theorist. That was his claim. Jim Garrison wanted to talk to him, and he either offed himself or he was offed. I'll let you make that judgment, but the guy's name is Gary Underhill. Don't take my word for it. Look it up.
Name is evading my mind. Maybe someone can find it. But yeah, he before Jim Garrison could interview him, he was found dead in his house with a bullet to his head. And there was obviously a lot of speculation. The autopsy said he committed suicide. There was a lot of speculation that he didn't. He talked about how he was so fearful, he felt like he had to leave the United States because he was going to be killed for going around saying that the CIA was involved and he was somebody connected to the CIA. And there's documents about that too. I can't say they were super revealing of things that weren't already known. They quote a left-wing magazine, Ramparts, about that story, but this story is confirmed. This is not the stuff of conspiracy theorists. No, I'm trying to get the name. It's a CIA associate who killed himself. I'm sure there are people in the chat who know as well. And
Gary Underhill.
1965, 1966, he was found dead in his house right as
66.
Jim Garrison was about to interview him as part of the investigation that he was conducting. We'll get back to you on that. But I'm just saying there's a lot of evidence that suggests CIA involvement or the involvement of other factions as well. I just showed you one document. I don't want to pretend that I've gone through the entire archive, that I'm ready to present to you all the revealing documents. I'm going to take my time and try and read through it all. But the Schlesinger memo is something that people have known about for a long time. There are major parts of it redacted. Now that we have the whole document, it at least sheds major light on what the CIA was doing well before the U.S. security state had an explosion of power and budget because of all the wars and operations I just reviewed over the next 40 years. But even back then, at the highest level, JFK was being told by his most trusted advisors that it was urgent the CIA be constrained, reined in, and reformed, put under the auspices of the State Department, transferred to the State Department, essentially. And there was always this competition between the CIA and the State Department. The State Department was perceived to be these weaklings, these effete diplomats who didn't want to get their hands dirty. The CIA were the tough guys, the ones who went and overthrew governments and killed people. And so the idea of being put under the auspices of the State Department to the CIA was horrifying. And obviously that was being discussed at the highest levels of JFK's government. So we will continue to work through these documents. We will continue to report to them on what it is that we find out. But I think even these parts that we've seen so far are very interesting and very revealing in lots of different ways.
Yeah, for me, it's just the methodology that the deep state uses to determine what's redacted. And we've seen from this document release that the biggest reason is to conceal the CIA's true function, its regime change operations. The Schlesinger memo was probably the biggest revelation to come from this that I've seen so far. Again, people have known about that a long time. Parts of it have been published, but the redacted portions really tell us a lot about what they're doing. Deep State and the CIA are the ultimate enemies of transparency. And thank you, President Trump, for this release. I've been really critical toward Trump about certain things, especially in regard to some foreign policy blunders, I believe. But dismantling U.S. aid and releasing these documents is a really good thing. Releasing these documents and the debacle that is the whole Epstein Files thing is like night and day. But this was a big win for the American people, for transparency, for, enemies of the deep state and people that want to rein in the federal bureaucracy that maintains power regardless of electoral outcomes, that are untouchable despite who is in the Oval Office, who controls Congress, who's sitting on the bench of the judiciary, etc. But I want to hear what you guys think. What do you think about this JFK Files release? What's been the most telling aspect of it to you? Let me know in a comment below, and please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and until I see you guys next time, peace out.